The battle over genetically modified foods is raging around the nation. State legislatures around the country are considering bills requiring manufacturers to label any GMO products. Lawmakers in several states are considering bills that would ban the production of genetically modified foods entirely. Debate on the subject has divided people into three camps: those who would ban GMOs, those who want them labeled, and people who just want to keep the status quo. Opponents of the drive to label GMOs claim such regulation will place unnecessary burdens on the industry. Many observers argue claims of dangers from genetically modified foods are unproven. The United States is currently the third most populous nation in the world, after China and India. Proponents of GMOs claim that feeding all 318 million people in the country would be difficult or impossible without genetically modified foods, and many consumers disagree with these claims. Andrew Demeter is a fresh face on the talk show circuit. The 16-year-old is quickly becoming one of the leading voices of his generation on several subjects, including genetically modified organisms. He's recently explored the connections between American consumers and food producers. The young journalist compiled his research in an online video we'll show you later in the program titled, "We the People, Genetically Modified." The video is going viral and has received over 9,000 views in less than 4 days. Demeter is our guest on the show today. We'll talk about the debate between those on each side of the GMO issue. We'll also discuss the backlash against the growing movement of people opposing the consumption of GMOs. Welcome to the program, Andrew.
Thanks for having me on, Gary.
Andrew, why did you become so interested in genetically modified foods at such a young age? You're only 16 years old.
Well, I'd have to say that the cause that led me into this research of GMOs and our genetically modified society really began with Food Inc., which is a Netflix documentary, also on YouTube, I believe, and that really dives headfirst into the whole GMO subject and shows you firsthand how farmers are affected and all these other people around the spectrum in all walks of life. And really that documentary showed me how essential or how vital this issue is and how it impacts our society. And that kind of led me onto the trail of research. And also, food is so essential to life. It affects everybody, transcends racial, ethnic boundaries, etc. And that's pretty much why I became rather interested in the topic.
Well, food definitely is required by everybody to survive. But why should people be concerned about consuming genetically modified food?
Well, like I said, food is essential to life. Everybody requires it, but specifically genetically modified food, the process by which an organism is genetically modified is pretty much when a gene, a piece of information is taken from one organism and put into a different species or another organism. And the alarming part about this is that when scientists do this to make this frankenfood, as it's dubbed, it can actually affect the organism in a variety of ways. In some organisms, such as corn, I believe, it can actually produce its own pesticide called Bt toxin. Now, while this is only toxic to insects and pesticides, it's still kind of alarming, and rats that have been fed this type of corn have actually developed tumors. So it begs the question, how does this food and these organisms that are genetically modified or genetically engineered, how does that affect and go into humans, and are these organisms safe?
How does the Bt toxin that is derived out of the genetically modified corn, how does it affect humans? What are the clinical trials that have been run to show that it's safe?
Well, the main problem with Bt toxin, like I said, it really only affects insects, so it's not too much of a human concern. But the problem is with this testing that the people who are testing these genetically modified organisms, these GMOs, are the very people who stand to gain by their approval. For example, Monsanto has tested genetically modified organisms, and they're the leading producer of corn, soybeans, and cotton. So are they going to really be saying, oh, well, these organisms are unsafe for human consumption and do that to their own business? Obviously not. Also, the FDA has tested these organisms And aspartame isn't a crop per se, but aspartame was actually passed. And aspartame, for those who don't know, is pretty much the excrement of genetically modified organisms. And what happened with that is the FDA, when it was tested on rats, it gave them tumors. And then the FDA, or the scientists at the FDA rather, cut those out. Or actually, this company was called GD Searle, my bad. And then the company, GD Searle, sent these results to the FDA after they cut out these tumors. The FDA said, well, this is kind of fishy business. We're going to need some more tests.
We should point out that, you know, since we're talking about aspartame, GD Searle was headed up by Donald Rumsfeld at the time you're speaking of.
Exactly. So that's the main concern, that GD Searle sent these results of the rats with the tumors cut out to the FDA. They said, no, we need to retest this. This is fishy business. So then they hired an independent board of scientists. Those independent boards of scientists were then concluded the same results, saying this is unsafe. And then someone related to the Reagan administration, so Donald Rumsfeld, he was then appointed to the FDA, passed aspartame to be on the market, and then fled to Monsanto or one of its relating law firms. So the relationship between government and corporation in the case of GMOs is just too close.
So you're saying that the parallels between aspartame and GMOs are help me here. Draw the direct connection.
So yeah, pretty much, like I kind of mentioned, there's this revolving door between private companies, private corporations, and government. For example, Michael Taylor, he is the current food safety czar at the FDA, and he previously worked at Monsanto. Clarence Thomas, although he didn't make the specific verdict in a case with Monsanto and seeds that blew into other farmers' farms and fields, he was also related to Monsanto, and then he's now in the government. So the relationship is too close. The people who are supposed to be regulating GMOs are the ones who are actually benefiting from their lack of banning, or they're the ones benefiting from GMOs being on the market.
So have these individuals provided disclosure?
Quite frankly, no. Monsanto has actually come out and said some things in specific, like I mentioned, Clarence Thomas. They said he wasn't the deciding factor for the verdict in this one case with Monsanto versus a farmer. But other people like Michael Taylor, the connection's right there. It's on the FDA's website, on Wikipedia as well. And Monsanto hasn't made any type of... Monsanto hasn't addressed this issue.
So
and
if there's a clear conflict of interest here, why haven't these people recused themselves from the discussion or approval of these products?
Well, they're really the ones to benefit from it, just like any other lobbyist in Washington. And even millions of dollars have been channeled into the opposition of GMOs to be banned or labeled. So there's definitely a conflict of interest. And if Monsanto touts these genetically modified organisms and these patents and this biotechnology that they have, then why aren't they excited, if all else, to label their products and say that this is genetically modified, especially if they're safe for human consumption? It just doesn't make any sense.
Interesting point. But haven't farmers been genetically engineering crops for centuries through cross-pollination and breeding?
Well, that's one of the main arguments that proponents of genetically modified organisms will bring up. But actually, genetic modification began in the 80s, and while farmers have selectively bred crops in the past, it hasn't been nearly to the same proportion that it is today. Previously, when they would do that, it would be to isolate a specific trait. However, now it has evolved to where Monsanto, among other biotech giants, have actually trying to their intent with genetic engineering now is to improve the taste or quality. That was their original intent, but now it is to actually increase the crop yield of these organisms, specifically the top
which brings
three.
Me to my next question, Andrew. How is it possible to feed 7 billion people worldwide without using genetically modified crops?
Well, I would have to kind of alter your question there, because personally, at least in my opinion, I think that the issue of world hunger and the growing population, in fact, isn't an issue with overpopulation. In fact, it's a disparity between those who have food and those who don't. In America, here we have a plethora of food and people are gluttonous, but in other places like Africa, there's not enough food. Now, you make a good point because Monsanto and other biotech giants have genetically modified rice, for example, to improve or enrich the vitamin A in it to mitigate blindness around the world. But to say that genetically modifying food is our only option for the future and to mitigate potential world hunger in the future, there are other options. For example, if everyone went vegetarian, while that's really a far-fetched idea, it is one way to bring more food around the world to more people with a growing population.
Now, why is opposition to GMO foods growing?
Well, kind of what I alluded to earlier, people who are supposed to be regulating these foods are the ones who aren't in fact regulating them and who are highly subsidized by corporations like Monsanto, Dow, Syngenta, etc. So the opposition has really been growing. And for example, in California with Proposition 37, millions of dollars, as I also mentioned, went into funding the opposition to labeling these organisms. And opponents of labeling say that, well, there's no need to label these foods or products rather, because these products are safe for consumption. But as I've said, the testing on these organisms is inconclusive. The testing periods are very short in time, so we really can't draw valid conclusions.
Andrew, what are some of the greatest obstacles to requiring the labeling of GMOs?
I would say the foremost obstacle on the path of labeling GMOs is simply awakening the consumer. And what I mean by that is currently we have all these nutrition labels on products and foods that have the calorie count, that have all these nutritional facts about it, but they don't contain anything saying genetically modified foods. So the best bet really for consumers in this opposition to labeling is to look for companies that are in fact showing that their foods are organic or non-GMO. So there's more faith in companies that are showing that they don't have GMOs as opposed to companies that saying that they do have GMOs. But one of the biggest obstacles, like I said, would have to be waking up the consumer, because what
about the companies that voluntarily label their products as GMO free?
Yeah, well, those companies, I applaud them because they're buying into the notion of the free market, that if people want foods that don't have GMOs, they're going to the brand that doesn't have them and advertises that. But there is a difference between non-GMO and organic that I'd like to point out as well. Non-GMO simply means that the product in question is not genetically modified, quite obviously. So there isn't really any scientific process going into the product relating to genetic engineering. Now, organic simply relates to a farming practice where pesticides are not used. So you could have a non-GMO product that isn't organic. And conversely, you could have a product that is not organic, that has pesticides, but doesn't contain genetically modified organisms.
Now, when the average consumer goes to the grocery store and they're going to be picking out their produce, they'll be picking out their cereals, they'll be picking out their meats, vegetables, all the things you find in the grocery store. What percentage of those products would you say are GMO? Or contain GMO ingredients?
I can't give you a specific or accurate statistic on that. I would say personally about 95% of those things, depending on where you shop, of course. But 90% of corn and cotton and 93% of soybeans planted in the United States are genetically modified. And those are crops that are found in pretty much every food item you will find, with a few exceptions. So when you take into account the amount of genetically modified crops, those three top crops that are in, by my estimate, 90 to 95% of the food that we eat, GMOs are pretty much everywhere.
So is it safe to say that the American public is constantly and regularly consuming GMOs, even without their knowledge.
Yeah, I would definitely say that's accurate because there's so much deception that goes on as well within the grocery industry because a lot of products will be labeled all natural, which honestly means nothing. It just means that the ingredients found in it or the product itself has been derived from somewhere through some process on the earth. So that means absolutely nothing. It's really false advertising, in my opinion. But so yeah, most people are really unaware of what they're eating, and I find it really concerning that so many people, when you ask them, do they know what a GMO is, like what I did in my documentary, so many of them are clueless. And even one time when I was at school eating lunch, one of my friends, there seems to be this diatribe when you try to talk about these issues like GMOs, serious issues other than the Grammys. But anyways, I was talking to one of my friends, and she said, well, I don't really care if I'm eating GMOs because I'm going to die anyways. And I said, well, I didn't say it, but I was thinking it. It's like, if you aren't afraid of GMOs or you're going to die anyways, according to that type of logic, why don't you go shoot heroin and run in traffic? It's absolutely ludicrous. And the level of ignorance is just insane.
Do GMO bans infringe on free enterprise?
Yes, I would say that GMO bans do infringe on the free market, but I'm not advocating the banning of GMOs. I simply think that they should be labeled like what we're saying about the free market. People should have the choice.
Does in the same regard, does GMO labeling infringe on free enterprise?
I don't think labeling infringes as much. Sure, you can make the argument that it does infringe, but I think banning would be a lot worse to the free market as what farmers or producers can create. So I think labeling is a lot more sensible, giving the consumers the ability to choose. And if they see that non-GMO label, I mean, right now we see organic products and people aren't apparently learning from that. So if products are labeled, I think that's really the best bet.
Well, if products were labeled, do you think that sales would increase or decrease for genetically modified products?
That kind of goes along with what I just said in the regard that right now there are organic products and people see those, but there really doesn't seem to be this connection between what they're putting in their mouth and what type of adverse health effects may or may not be present in the food that they're eating. So possibly it could instill, as opponents of GMO labeling claim, unnecessary fear of these organisms' safety. But ultimately, I think labeling is sensible. Right now, fast food restaurants have to put the amount of calories that are in food on the boards outside of their restaurants. So I think that labeling is sensible, and I think it's something that all consumers should have the knowledge to
what would a GMO label look like to you? Would it list the ingredients and then what type of genetically modified cross-breeding species elements have been added? I mean, what would a GMO label look like?
Aesthetically, I'm not entirely sure, but something to the effect of, I guess right now in the organic products that are out there, before each ingredient, instead of just saying wheat, if it was a conventional product, it would say organic wheat. So I think something like that, a system like that would be promising. But also this brings me to the point that is pretty interesting as well. Even USDA organic labels, when in my documentary, I actually interviewed an employee, a biotechnologist at the USDA in Washington, and she said actually that with a USDA organic label, that doesn't mean that the product is entirely organic. It can actually have at minimum 95% of organic product. Now, it can't be lower than 95, so sure, it's more healthful than a conventional product that doesn't have that label, but still there's this deception going on between not only the producer and the consumer, but also the government and that revolving door and the consumer.
Now, you mentioned your documentary, and we're going to play that in just a few minutes. Did you encounter any opposition to some of the revelations that you made in your documentary?
Yeah, namely, it was actually pretty funny because when I really got the first idea for the documentary when I was visiting a grocery store, local grocery store. And while I was there was this health specialist there who brought up the idea of GMOs. That's not how I learned about GMOs, but we had a brief conversation on them. And through him, when I was searching for interviewees to talk to for this documentary, he was one of the first people that came to mind. And then when I emailed him, he seemed super enthused about participating. And then eventually, a few days before we had scheduled the interview, he said, you know, I'm actually not qualified to talk about this. So he was just one of many cases. Also, there was a doctor who was very interested, and then at the last minute, he canceled because he didn't have the right credentials, even though I knew about him through a friend who had been there, and he talked to him about GMOs for hours. And also politicians, as it shouldn't really be a surprise, honestly, but politicians, everyone that I contacted refused to be interviewed for this documentary.
Now, despite some of the opposition that you received, how has the documentary been received overall since it's been released?
Overall, like you mentioned at the beginning of this segment, it has actually garnered over 9,000 views on We Are Change, actually. Luke Rudkowski, he's a good pal who reposted that on his channel for me. And also on my channel, it's gotten quite a bit of recognition as well. And hopefully, if I do end up winning this contest for C-SPAN, that's who's sponsoring or hosting the contest, rather, hopefully we can bring this issue to light, because right now it's definitely not getting enough attention, especially in Congress where it really needs to be seeking that attention.
All right, Andrew, thanks for joining us here on WHDT.
Thanks for having me.
All right, that was Andrew Demeter right here on WHDT. Stay tuned. After the break, when we return, you're going to see his mini documentary on GMO foods entitled We the People, Genetically Modified. Stay tuned.